Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on bhakti. Now, generally when people talk about bhakti, they will talk about sort of the primary mode of Hindu experience. Bhakti means devotion, so having devotion for a deity. Now, when people describe this, it's generally very North Indian, but we'll see that the main innovation that creates bhakti as it is was Southern, and in fact was often around the deity of Shiva. But we've been through Krishna before, we'll see Krishna again, and we've seen that Krishna is often depicted as a much bigger deal than he actually is throughout sort of the history of Hinduism, but that's because he's so prominent right now. Vishnu is just so prominent right now. Rama and Krishna are so prominent in contemporary Hinduism, but really the bhakti that we see nowadays really gets going in the 14th century. But how do we get there? Well, let's see. First off, what is bhakti? Well, a general worldview of bhakti or a general bhakti is usually very Vaishnava of Vishnu, like I said, but we're going to sort of excavate that today. Bhakti comes from the root bhaj, to share. So a devotee shares in the relationship with the deity, and that relationship is characterized by extreme devotion and emotion on behalf of, or on the part of the devotee toward the deity. Now, this is not just sort of like having a personal relationship with God or feeling God's love, and very much the way that we think of with Protestant Christianity. This is a different paradigm of a very extreme emotion and sharing an emotion with the divine. So what are the various relationships that one can have with God in bhakti? Well, these relationships that people will have with the divine are characterized by different bhavas or emotions. So the first one would be sort of shanta, the placid love for God. That is one just kind of dwelling in this just general love of God. Then you have the relationship or the emotion of being a servant or a slave to God, dasya, or dasya, which means das just means slave. So this is the Lord. The Lord is literally your Lord. You are the extreme servant. The Lord is your ruler. You are his subject. Then there is sakya, to be the friend of God, to have a friendly relationship with a deity. Then you also have vatsala, so that's the relationship of a mother for a child, so seeing God as being your child. And then there's madhurya, which means like the sweet love, the love of that a woman has toward her lover. So these are different emotions than we're used to thinking about when we think of divinities. So we've seen deities so far. They give you powers. You've seen people having relationships with them where they're reverential, where they worship them, where they see them as sort of the progenitor of the whole universe. But we haven't seen this, thinking of God as a friend or thinking of God as your complete dominating one that you are constantly serving, but you're doing that out of a great joy. Let alone the relationship of you having a relationship with the deity as if that deity is your lover, specifically a woman pining after a lover who's male, who she is separated from. So such emotions will characterize that relationship with a god. Some people, like I have a friend who says she feels so close to God that it is like a mundane relationship. And she'll say to the goddess that she's reverential to, she'll say, I've had enough of you. That's enough of you today. I'll talk to you tomorrow. You're too much right now, which I've always thought is sort of amusing. Sort of like, you got to give me a break, God. I'm done with you today. Some maintain a quite formal sense of separation. So it's really that longing, that sense of longing for God, who we are separated for, like lovers that are separated. And that pain of separation from God is an overwhelming emotions. Now, these relationships can actually be troubling. So a lover might be missed, but also the Lord might enslave the servant or that child that one is waiting on God and attending to God, especially with Krishna as a child. That child could become quite demanding and like a petulant child. So this lends a level of emotion that we haven't seen before. So there are two forms of God when you're talking about Hinduism. So they'll talk about saguna and nirguna. You remember that word guna? We had that before in Sankhya. Guna just means qualities. So nirguna, without qualities, saguna, with qualities. So with form or without form is another way to look at it. So is God an extreme principle that we can call Shiva, that is the fundament of everything, or that is out there and is completely different from us, but we know it exists, sort of a transcendental God? And then you also have the term immanent, or a God who's right here with us. So a God that can intervene in your life, but also a God with qualities, with name and form and stories about him or her. We'll come back to this distinction of nirguna, God without qualities or without forms, and saguna, with qualities or with forms. Theoretically, you can have both in bhakti. You can have devotion to either, and we'll see a group that does have a devotion to nirguna. But nirguna God would be very much the God of philosophy, the God where you're like, Shiva is all consciousness, and I yearn to connect with him and see that I am him always. Or in Advaita Vedanta, realizing that God is nirguna, completely without qualities. To see God with qualities in any way, or saguna, would be to be within the realm of maya or delusion. So bhakti in general is far more saguna than it is nirguna. Devotees are said to hold the qualities and the names of gods in their heads and in their hearts, making the relationship with God the most prevalent thoughts in their heads and hearts. So what I really want you to see is we're really looking at saguna gods here. Saguna God, God with quality, God with name, God with form. Okay, so in Vedanta, which is a school of thought that means the end of the Vedas or the termination of the Vedas or the results of the Vedas, you have three distinctions for understanding God. I'm giving you a lot of vocabulary here, but it all overlaps. So Advaita Vedanta literally means pure non-dualism. Advaita means not Dvaita, two. Non-dual, not two. Then you have Dvaita, or two. Dvaita, Dwa, two. Indo-European there again. So dualism. So man and God are separated. Spirit and the nature are separate. Think Sankhya, but also think the bhakti relationship of Dvaita, where I am worshiping God. I'm not worshiping myself. I'm not worshiping something that is essentially me. Man and God are different. This is the prominent paradigm, despite what people will say, for the majority of worship practices within Hinduism. You worship a God who is other than you, that you can know, who has name and form, but is other than you. Now you also have, and you see this also within Bhakti, is Dvaita Dvaita, two within one, or qualified dualism, or even qualified, there's another term, Vashishta Dvaita, which is qualified non-dualism. Here we're arguing that everything is essentially God, and God is different from man, but man can aspire to be near God, or even to unify God. One prominent scholar once said, I want to taste sugar, not be sugar. So when you become sort of liberated, you go and you live with God, right next to God, so close, but not unified with God. So you can have the pure pleasure of worshiping God and being around God. One term that we saw in the reading is in Dvaita Dvaita. You see that God is other, or paratva, but is also easy to access. So saulabhya is the Sanskrit term. What this means is God is other and transcendent, but you can get access to him and God will pay attention to you. So God is transcendent and immanent at the same time. Again, different paradigms for thinking about divinity. So for the first time, we've seen God giving salvation. That salvation could be liberation, but mostly it is attaining an eternity and an eternal life in the land of the deity, near to the deity. Before, we saw that salvation was secured by means of asceticism and religious practice, by yoga, or even piety, not just a direct appeal or devotion to God. In bhakti, if you repeat the name of God fervently and love God, bhakti and God will give you salvation at the end of the day. So while bhakti might seem simple, you just love God with all your heart, we'll see that it can be extreme. We'll see saints that will leave their homes and their families for the sake of God. People even cutting parts of their bodies off for the glory of God. Even folks killing and eating their own children. We'll get to that. All for the sake of God. So don't think of this as just being simple. You just love God and it's all fine. The idea is you melt yourself into your love of God. Your love of God becomes such intense emotion that you have that there becomes nothing left but that love of God. And that is bhakti. It's not simple. It's not easy. It's not mere sort of Protestant Christianity where you have this idea that, oh, if I accept God in my heart, I'm safe. There is that notion kind of that if you love God, you're saved. But it's still a very active emotionality and an active presence and state of being toward God. All right, let's do a little bit of review here because I want to show how bhakti becomes the prominent mode of Vaishnava worship. Remember, Vaishnava, gods related to Vishnu. Now remember bricolage Krishna who's a crazy quilt, Krishna who's made out of 1,000 gods all put together. Well, let's review real quick and see how bhakti comes into this. And remember, Krishna really does become the main deity who is worshipped in the North especially, and I would say in contemporary Hinduism, in this bhakti mode. So Krishna in the Mahabharata was just the baddest dude ever. He was just the baddest dude ever. There's some arguments in like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata about how folks should take refuge in him and in his and how his cosmic form is vast, but it's not that he is the full totality of existence. He's not conferring liberation and salvation via his grace. He's saying to do yoga and do yoga with devotion and through devotion, and that will attain salvation. So it's not quite bhakti yet. Then you have cowboy Krishna, who's the god of the Gopala people in Western India. He's the god who lifts the Mount Govardhana to save the Gopala people when Indra is raining down upon them this tremendous rainstorm. So cowboy Krishna, and also the little boy Krishna. So these are later stories about his youth and his childhood that come after the Mahabharata. Then you have Vishnu. We have Vishnu, this sort of oldish god. We see mention of him in the Vedas, but we don't see much about him. He's kind of vague. We have stories about him and how he sort of pervades the universe, how he dreams the world that comes out of his navel as he reclines on the many hoods of the giant serpent that lives under the sea. At a certain point, we see that Vishnu becomes sort of the main general god. They're like, okay, Vishnu has avatars. He has incarnations. So anybody we can, like Parashurama and Krishna and Rama and Narasimha, we're going to make all of them Vishnu. Who are Vishnu? Vishnu are a whole bunch of deities. So here we see formerly independent deities become manifestations of Vishnu, not unlike Rama, not unlike Krishna. They all become incarnations of Vishnu. However, sort of from the south, we see something new, and it heads north. God is said to be everything and to be the most important thing, and you need to relate to him in a sense of devotion, complete devotion. Bhakti is overwhelming. This devotion overwhelms and collapses all identity and sense of separation. This South Indian Bhakti was predominantly Shaiva. It was mostly about Shiva. But when it went north, it became very much about Vishnu and became about this sort of bricolage of Krishna and Vishnu. So South Indian Bhakti becomes sort of the earliest strata, the earliest level for devotion-based modes of religion. I would argue that bhakti has a history, that these gods have histories. Nothing is handed down in one piece from a transcendent source, but that's true of all religion. All religious phenomenon change as a part of the convolution, as a part of conversation and sort of evolution of ideas throughout time. So keep in mind our sort of paradigm when you're thinking about avatars and all the Vaishnava deities, that all of them have independent histories, but they get collapsed and then they are attached to this idea of bhakti from the south, this incredible explosive love that removes all sense of limitation. So what's going on in the contemporary scene when people talk about bhakti? Well, in the contemporary world, most Hindus, especially educated Hindus, will argue that bhakti is the most important or even the most essential thing in Hinduism. Bhakti is synonymous with the worship of Vishnu as Ram or as Krishna, as Rama or as Krishna, as Ram or as Krishna. Now, however, there are people who will worship Shiva in a bhakti manner. They will usually be more focused on an incarnation of Shiva or a form of Shiva, or even a not form, as in the Shiva Linga, the phallic symbol that's also a stylized version of the union of masculine and feminine that creates the entirety of the universe. In general, when Shaivas talk about Shiva, they'll tell stories about him and they'll show pictures of him. But when they talk about Shiva, even in a devotional manner, they use more of a nirguna quality, more of a less quality. Shiva as that principle, Shiva as the punchline for every joke, Shiva as the source of all things, Shiva as the very play of consciousness that it underlies everything we do and everything we encounter. Now, we also see notions of people worshiping goddesses in a bhakti manner, in particular, Kali and Durga. Now, there's a conflation here because goddesses are always thought to be sort of mother goddesses. So if you have a relationship with the deity as like your parent, well, it's very natural if you worship a goddess to think of that goddess as your mother. But that notion of goddess as divine mother gets turbocharged with bhakti and makes all those emotions even more intense. I'm intrigued that Kali and Durga seem to be the deities most worshipped in a bhakti mode, and notably, they're more wrathful goddesses. So if you're going to worship a goddess in this overtly bhakti sort of manner, you want kind of a scary one with a lot of weapons, one that can really step in and help you out and take care of your enemies. It's intriguing to me that I don't see a lot of bhakti discussions of sort of Pacific goddesses, of a Lakshmi or a Saraswati. There's something about a peaceful female deity that doesn't encourage the mind and heart in the same way as a wrathful one. And there's a lot to be said for that observation. So, bhakti can have a little bit of a dark side. So this extreme emotion to a deity makes people sectarian. If you believe so much in your God and that your God is so great, you're going to not like other gods and you're going to kind of poo-poo other gods. So also the direct experience of the deity and the relationship with the deity means folks can actually have a genuine revelation from the deity. So that means if I decide, or if I have witnessed Krishna come down and say, you need to kill all those Muslims, you're going to go kill a bunch of Muslims. It's kind of terrible. So the minute that people can say that their bhakti, that their devotion has caused the deity to reveal him or herself to them, then they can say that whatever argument that they want to make comes from the deity. So it becomes a religious argument that whatever I'm saying comes from the lips of God, which makes it more genuine, which makes it more authentic. Political actors might justify their bad actions due to devotion. So we'll talk later about the destruction of the Babri Masjid that happened in the late 20th century. Now, in this situation that happened, supposedly a priest saw the god Ram, who was saying, hey, this is where I was born. In reality, the temple had been a mosque for like 500 years before that. It might have been a Shaiva temple. It might have been a Jain temple. It was never a Ram temple. And then from there, a whole bunch of people that decided that they were Hanuman's monkey army and that they were doing the will of Ram went and destroyed the temple and also killed thousands of Muslims in the wake of this. So bhakti emotion can be used to whip up emotions, and those whipped up emotions can be dangerous. Now, within bhakti, as we'll see, it's ostensibly anti-Brahmin, and it claims many non-Brahmin figures as saints. They'll also claim that a tribal or village worshiper will worship with more emotion for their village deity than they will anywhere else. But in the end of the day, these non-Brahmin saints are sometimes they're actually turned into Brahmins later, saying that through their devotion, they become Brahmins. Or folks will say that, oh, you don't want to worship in the way they worship, but you want to emulate their emotions, but you still need to do it the Brahmin way. So a lot of this sort of anti-caste stuff gets repackaged, and they say that, oh, yeah, all the important things were about that genuine emotion there. Don't worry about those things they were saying about how you don't need to be a Brahmin or you don't need to go to a temple. That's a whole other ballgame. Okay. So we're going to talk about the South Indian context here. So by the South India, I mean Maharashtra and the South. So if you look over there, you see Maharashtra and Orissa. Those are kind of like your boundary lands for South India. And then everywhere below that, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka are definitely South Indian. So South India is kind of different. South and North India are geographically divided by a mountain range called the Vindhya Mountains, but there was always contact between them. Now, the languages in the South are what's called Dravidian, which is a non-Indo-European language. The languages in the North are Indo-European, so they're related to our language. In the South, they sound very different because they're a different language family. I've learned a non-Indo-European language when I learned Tibetan, but I've never learned Tamil or Telugu or Malayalam. I find them really difficult and hard to discern anything when I listen to them, but I don't really have the ear for it. So the people are considered racially different. They're much darker. There's always been exchange between the North and the South, but you do notice that there's a very distinctive racial and ethnic difference when you go south. When I first went to the South, in '99, when I first went to India, at the time, the North was considered sort of like the height of civilization, and the South were just sort of like considered very ritually pure and religiously honest, but being kind of backward. These days, the South has come into its own, and this is where we find the majority of high-tech ventures coming in the South. The Indian Silicon Valley is in south of India. Also in the South, there was always a stronger Jain and Buddhist influence. And there was always a lot of tensions between them and the Hindus, but it was rarely violent. Okay, so in the South, especially in Tamil Nadu, which is the state in the Southeast, we have quite a few saints. Now, these saints are the Shaiva Nayanmars and the Vaishnava Alvars. So they also have a Krishna-like figure named Tirumal. And one of the things, and I don't want to get into too much, is you have a lot of the same deities in the South that you have in the North, but they have Tamil names. So they have South Indian names. They have a little bit different iconography. Yeah, okay. So these sort of saints took sort of prior notions of devotion in Indian culture that would be toward a guru or a king and applied them to gods. And they got specific about the gods of the locality, the larger gods of Tamil Nadu. So in fact, we find the earliest literature we have in the Tamil language are collections of these saints who are also poets and their works. Some have many hymns, some have only a few, but these are the earliest versions of the Tamil language, which arguably goes back as far as Sanskrit, but we just don't have the records of it in the same way we have the Sanskrit in the North. However, there were quite a few Sanskrit scholars that came out of the South. So it's not that they didn't know Sanskrit there, but they knew Sanskrit and Tamil. All right, so yes. So there's a perspective that shifts in these poems, and you see that the narrator is often in the subject position, describing the experience of relating to God. Think of it this way. The majority of literature we've looked at it so far is in the third person. Suddenly, it's in the first person. Shiva has a personal relationship with the devotee, and the devotee can describe it from the first person. There is an intimacy and an immanence to the relationship with God, and they can describe it from that I position. Now, the temple architecture is quite different in the South. I actually think it's better than in the North. Temple structures in the North are supposed to look like a chariot. Temples in the South look like like the abode of a king, like a temple palace. So in the South, temples have a central, small, aniconic figure. In the North, however, let me say this again. In the South, you have these big temples, and you'll see in these pictures here, these are like, they'll usually have in 4 directions, or sometimes they'll only have one. They'll have these giant towers. So that's not where the main part of the god lives. The main god lives sort of between those towers in a place called the Garbhagriha, the womb house. Whereas these these towers are like turrets, and they have all sorts of depictions of deities. They're really intricately carved. A lot of them are really beautifully painted. And if you can look, you can see that they're almost like these little cells going up the tower. Each one of those cells tells as a depiction of a god, and usually tells a mythological story. And they're usually really beautifully carved. So what's interesting is you have a small god that'll be like a lingam in the center, or a special stone or whatnot, or a small kind of very basic image. But then when you get out to the outside, you see all these depictions of gods that are just phenomenally intricate. And that tells you a little bit about how they think of things. So like I'd said, in the North, the temple is said to look like a chariot. In the South, the temple looks like a palace. In fact, in Tamil, they use the same word for a king's palace as the word for a temple. And temples are thought to be the palace, the palace of a king. And the god is supposed to be like a king. In some areas, they'll even say that this area is under the dominion of that god. So one area I like to go, they'll say that, in this place, we are all free and taken care of under Jagatnath's Rastriya, under the lordship and kingship, and in the kingdom of Jagannath, the god becomes like a king. Also, this time, people building temples replaced sponsoring large sacrifices for royal legitimacy. So instead of hiring Brahmin priests to do rituals, you just build a temple. Intriguingly, you'd also hire Brahmin priests to work in the temples. In this way, and I just came to this insight recently, remember, we don't really have temples until the 6th century. This is the first we're really looking at temples. So without temples, what were priests doing? Well, they were doing rituals for kings and rituals for wealthy people and doing grand Vedic sacrifices. Well, when you had temples, the priest started serving the god as if he was the king. So people would go and it'd be like, the king is the god and the priest is like his royal chaplain. And when you go to worship the god / the king, you would have his royal chaplain, his royal priests do the worship rituals for you or explain the worship rituals for you. So in this way, God becomes like king and priest becomes like these characters called the Purohitas, who are the king's priests. See how that kind of works? All right, so this imperial metaphor is sort of grafted onto personal religion. So the god becomes your king. And at the same time, kings become greater, and kings, by them thinking this way, kings become like gods. In fact, so they start talking about their queens as being like divine consorts. So if I was the king, if I was King Raja, and my wife was Devi, I would be like Shiva, and she would be like Parvati. So at the same time that the gods become like kings, the kings become like gods. It goes back and forth between ruler and divinities. But these temples are really interesting because they opened up the ability for anybody to support the temples by going and giving gifts, just going and giving gifts and sponsoring rituals. You didn't have to set up a system of exchange with a group of brahmanas or go give tax to a king. You just go to a temple and do it. We can also note that the caste system was different in the South, and there's much less gradation. So most people are just split between Brahmins and Shudras. And in this way, Shudras could just go to a temple, give money, boom, you're good. You don't have to be in that whole system with a kshatriya to get everything to work so you can sponsor a ritual. You don't need that. Now, one thing I wanted to take a step back from is talk about another group. And this was written about in Ramanujan's work that we read today, his essay on Bhakti myths. So there's a group called the Virashaivas, who are also called the Lingayats. Now, the Virashaivas and the Lingayats are a Bhakti group in South India that reject many key elements of Orthodox Hinduism. In fact, they worship a formless Nirguna Shiva, and the way they worship him is by worshiping the linga. They aren't into images. They are really into these specific linga stones. And in fact, both sexes, male and female, will wear a special linga as jewelry. And they're given this when they're initiated. Now, often people are initiated in the womb, and the guru takes a very small linga and ties it to the mother's linga. And then after the baby is born, they untie it from the mother's linga, and then they tie it to the baby, and the baby will wear that linga their whole life, which is kind of cool. It sort of replaces that whole notion of a sacred thread. Instead, it's a linga. And they actually they reject all caste and gender distinction. So anybody can get initiated, and male or female, you can do the worship. Their theology is that all is one, so sort of non-dualism, but they qualified non-dualism, and argue that all is actually Shiva. So everything is one, and that one is actually Shiva. And at death, you will unite with him or dwell with him, praising him forever. So this is Dvaita Advaita, sort of a unity of all things within duality. So all is one, but all is also Shiva, and you worship Shiva, and when you die, you will be with Shiva. So they had some pretty bold arguments. They argued that by virtue of getting initiated and becoming a Virashaiva or a Lingayata, you're in your last lifetime. You are guaranteed that when you die, because you've been initiated, you will go to Shiva, you will be liberated and just live with him. They bury their dead. They don't, because, hey, they're not going to be reincarnated. So they bury their dead. They're 100% vegetarian. They're an initiatory order that, as I said, most of them are initiated at birth or before birth. But in fact, anyone can come and join regardless of caste. They're a sizable population. So in Karnataka, which is a pretty big state in South India, they're 20% of the population. And Maharashtra they're a pretty big group as well at 10% of the population. Maharashtra is where Bombay is. They have recently fought hard in the courts to be recognized as not Hindus. They might be Shaivas, but they reject so much of Hinduism Whereas I'd said before that bhakti might challenge a lot of castes, these folks really do it. They really do challenge caste. Supposedly they worship an aniconic Shiva, but Ramanujan notes that when they're writing about Shiva, they're usually writing about the relationship with Shiva, but they refer to mythological stories. So here's one poem that I think is really great. When the ghosts read the writing on the skulls, Shiva wears around his neck. They know this one is Brahma, this is Vishnu, this one is Indra, this is death. And as they play happily with them, Shiva smiles, he laughs, our God. So this is a story about how all of time and everything is just kind of a joke when you really understand Shiva. We know that Shiva transcends all those other gods. All those other gods are dead and he wears them around his neck. But he calls people to be laughing and joyful. And we know that we will be with him, and we are with him now. So Shiva calls us to be joyful in the face of all things. But, you know, like Ramanujan's making this argument that they say they don't believe in a formless or in a formed God with name and form, but you find all this iconography in it anyway. Here's another poem that I think is really great. The rich who make temples for Shiva, what shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. That's the shrine and the Torah. Listen, O Lord of the meeting of the rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving over shall stay. I mean, Ramanujan was just such a great translator. So this was by Basavana, and he was the guy that translated or that first posited the theology of the Virashaivas. So what I wanted to make a point of here is, in fact, that here the temple is made out of the body. Notice it's a person who says, I'm poor, I can't build a temple. I can chop my body up though and turn that into a temple. So it's bold. I mean, it's not just I love God, it's I will sacrifice my entire body to make a temple to praise him. So like I said, there's a lot of saints in this order, and I'm moving away from the Virashaivas and back towards sort of the general Tamils. So there are these saints and there are folk stories, and these are people that really drive bhakti devotion in the South. They become, the saints are actually people who kind of reject the world and reject usual religious modes. We note here that Shiva himself can become like a culture hero, challenging the norms and establishing new paradigms. And I want to talk about three saints that we saw in two of our readings in Ramanujan and Danagar. All right, so Karayakal Amayarai, oh man, I don't speak Tamil. Karaikal Amayaira. See, this is how you guys try with all that Sanskrit. It's tricky. All right, mid-6th century. So she's got a great story. She was from a wealthy family, and she worshipped Shiva, and she was well married, and she was very beautiful. And Shiva came to her so pleased with her devotion that he gave her these magic mangoes. Well, her husband got jealous of the mangoes, and he left. And she said, well, you know, whatever. I'll keep worshiping Shiva. I'll keep the household. Husband is husband. I'm still married to him, whatever. And eventually he takes another wife. And she's like, oh, hell no, I am out. So the funny thing is about this story is you hear a lot about this first part of the story. This woman who's so devoted to Shiva, and then, you know, her husband gets jealous because she gets this gift from God. And then they don't really tell the rest of the story. Well, the rest of the story is great. She leaves her home and she goes on pilgrimage to the Himalayas, walking on her hands the whole way there. She becomes gaunt and dark. And eventually she goes to the Himalayas and she lives in the cremation grounds and hangs out with Shiva. And Shiva gives her the boon to live with him forever. And she's basically has been transformed into this skeleton-like ghoulish demon. So out of her devotion, she gets what she wants. She becomes a demon who is always with Shiva. Remember, Shiva is always hanging out. He's the Lord of Ghosts. The Bhutanata, the Lord of Ghosts, the Lord of Demons. So she becomes part of his demon horde. Her devotion is so much that makes her leave her home and her family and to become like this goblin creature to hang out with Shiva. That's some devotion right there. Now, this is the story of Kanapar. Now, this is a story that I've heard a lot. I remember hearing it from my first Hinduism teacher. I know people tell me this story all the time when I'm in the South. It's not found in the North. So Kanapar is a hunter and a cattle thief, in fact, but he absolutely loves Shiva. And he hangs out with dogs and he kills animals. And he does this whole kind of thing. He's a hunter type guy. Remember, we saw that Shiva was associated with hunters in the Mahabharata. Well, he's wandering through the forest one day and he finds an image. Maybe it's a lingam. If you look to the left, if you look to the right, it's a lingam that he's touching. If you look to the left, it's probably more likely what he would have seen, which would have been some sort of a face by a tree. Likely this would be some sort of a yaksha figure, and yaksha figures are connected with Shiva. So he kicks aside all the flowers that the Brahmin has put there, and he offers up cut up meat to Shiva, and he washes the lingam with spit from his mouth because he doesn't have any water. All this is incredibly sacrilegious. His dog is hanging out with him. He puts his left hand or his right leg or left leg up and actually touches the deity with his foot. This is all a problem. Anyway, a Brahmin comes in the morning and is like, whoa, what is going on here? And he knocks off all the flowers that he'd taken out of his hair, and he cleans the linga just right, and he gets all the meat away. And at that point, Shiva becomes displeased because it had offered with such devotion these things. So Shiva's eye starts to bleed, and Kanapar comes forward and he says, no, God, that sucks. Here, let me help you. And he cuts out one of his eyes and takes with his foot and puts the eye into the eye of Shiva that was bleeding. And at that point then, and Shiva's angry at the Brahmin for his behavior, he starts to make his third eye bleed. And at that point, Kanapar takes an arrow and he's about to gouge out his other eye. And Shiva says, nope, that's enough. And he restores his body, but leaves him with one eye. And he's always known as the one-eyed devotee. And the story of this shows how this tribal man and tribal manners supposedly is more devoted than the Brahmin that's just doing things mechanically. I would argue that the story is told as being not about you should offer meat or flesh or whatever, you should break rules about how to worship Shiva, but it's that, or that these types of offerings are okay, but it's that you have to have an extreme type of devotion like that of Kanapar. Finally, we have the very gruesome story of the little devotee that gets told all over South India. And in this story, there's a family that's very devoted to Shiva. One day, Shiva takes the form of Bhairava, his wrathful form with a dog and a skull and whatnot. He's all scary looking. And he also displays himself as a yogi. The yogi comes by, maybe he's God, maybe he's just a yogi, who knows? But the family are big devotees of Shiva. So they treat him and they offer him foods and whatnot. But what does he demand? He demands a stew made of human flesh. In fact, he says, cut up your child, cut up your son there, the one that you love so much, cut him up and make him into a stew. And the parents kill the child. They break his bones apart to make little pieces of marrow. They cook his flesh in one way. They cook his organs in another into this tasty stew. And they sit down, they eat this curry stew with this yogi who looks like Bhairava. And the yogi, who is God, who is Shiva, is so pleased with their devotion and granting even the son to them that he says, where is your son? And they start to get really, maudlin because they killed their son. And the son comes running in. In some variants of the story, they say that when they smell the boy's skin, it smells like one particular type of their food. And it all, like his body parts smell like the different types of spices they use to make the curry. And at that point, God is very pleased. And he says, all right, gets the boys back to life. And he brings everybody and brings them up to heaven. And they all live with him forever. And it's a happy ending of the story. I think it's a horrifying story, but I am amused by it. And it's a story that gets told often, but it's told about how you should be that devoted to Shiva, that if God asks you for your son, then you'll cut him up and kill him. Is this creepier than the story of Abraham and Isaac? I don't know. YHVH comes down and stops him before he kills his kid. YHVH doesn't make Abraham cut his kid up and cook him into a stew and make him eat his kid with him. It's a pretty gnarly story, but it shows these extreme levels of devotion. This is what I mean to say. Bhakti isn't just, I love God, God is good, I feel the love of God. It's more than that. So in these types of stories, Ramanujan once again states this. And A.K. Ramanujan was just an amazing professor who worked with Wendy Doniger. He trained one of my PhD advisors and a number of colleagues that I consider very dear. And they always describe him as a gentleman and a scholar. He was a wonderful translator. You got a glimpse of that from his translations in the article we read. As one can see, Shiva's playfulness, even his love of violent pranks, are intimately extended into the ordinary human realm. Very little of the erotic ascetics is seen here. He's referring explicitly to Wendy Doniger's book, Erotic Ascetic. They were colleagues. When he grants his well-tested devotees their final salvation, he often appears as a householder with his entire clan and takes them, kin, clan, and all to his Kailasa, up to his heavenly abode where they live forever. We're really close to understanding contemporary bhakti, but there's one more thing we need. Krishna and South Indian Bhakti needs one more thing to get to contemporary bhakti. And that thing is a dude named Chaitanya. Now, Chaitanya lived in the 14th century, and this is really the roots. This is where mature bhakti really comes from. He had that idea. He knew these bhakti ideas from the South. Now, he was a charismatic figure, and he created the paradigm of bhakti that it becomes essential for understanding Vaishnava bhakti to this day. He was a prominent writer and a mystic with a wide range of disciples. He lived in Bengal, in fact. He became so identified with Radha, Krishna's girlfriend, that he would dress in women's clothing and dance as a woman, as we see him here, a man in women's clothing, dancing in rapture around Radha. His other companions he would identify as being the other sort of cowherd friends of Krishna. So in all of his daily life, he would become enraptured with Krishna and live out his days trying to be Radha. And this way, he was said to see everything happening around him as being just Krishna interacting with his girlfriend Radha, and he was trying to be Radha and to love Krishna as Radha loved Krishna, to the point he was said to even lactate and grow breasts, and like a miracle. So this is a story of a somewhat non-binary character in Chaitanya, but it was considered very holy. This wasn't a profane sexuality. So what he would try to do is become so much Radha that he would see all the people around him as the other gopis and as the other cowherders and as Krishna. And he would try to do everything he could do in life in this rapturous state and say, oh, I'm getting up. This is like when Krishna and Radha get up. Oh, now I'm going for breakfast like Krishna and Radha do. Now it's time for me to go out midday to the fields and hang out with the other cowherders, just like Krishna would. And I'll do that too. Now, from all of this, he develops a type of spirituality that becomes really prominent in later bhakti. He sees that the mythical land of Vraja, Krishna's childhood, can be encountered in the mind and the heart, but you can also, through a sort of mystic experience, you can transpose all the childhood life of Krishna and all of the events of Krishna's life into everything you do in the day. Because the reality is the truth of the world is Radha and Krishna making love and having their wonderful cosmic daily experiences at all times. That's the only true thing. Our life is false. If you realize that everything is really just Krishna and Radha, and you bring that to everything you see, then you will have a whole new change of consciousness, and you will live as if you are with Krishna at all times. This is actually used to establish various pilgrimage places in which Chaitanya and other later figures would say, oh, in the land of Raj, that's where all this stuff happened. But also over here in Bengal, that's where all this stuff happened. So you have various places across India where people will live out all the actions of Krishna by putting sort of, by telling the stories and saying that, oh, all that stuff that you thought happened over here, it actually really happened here. So in this way, you can create whole new sort of pilgrimage place. You say, oh, that's where Krishna took all the gopis' clothes. That's where he killed Kamsa. That's where he drank the poisoned milk of Putana. And if I say those are the places, and then I go to them and I think through them in all the times, then my daily life as I go to those places are all in doing the memory of Krishna, remembering the sport of Krishna. They call this the Krishna Lila, the divine play of Krishna that can be encountered in all of these holy places, but that you should encounter in every moment of your life. So, but what is modern bhakti? And we're at the end here. So the influence of Chaitanya's system creates so much of what we see in bhakti today, with people living out the play of Krishna, acting like Krishna, seeing Krishna everywhere. We see that in modern bhakti, all of the deities are considered to be Vishnu and Krishna. So Jagannath is Krishna, Rama is Krishna, or Rama is Vishnu. Krishna and Vishnu become somewhat synonymous. Singing and dancing and playing music and playing with one another and doing pilgrimage all become bhakti. That all comes out of Chaitanya. Some people will argue that this was an influence of Christianity or Hinduism or Islam, because there are Christians that have been there since the 1st century, and then you'd have Muslims since like the 7th and 8th century, and then bhakti really gets going kind of later up to the 14th century. I don't think so. In its origins, it's indigenously and inherently Indian. However, that said, in the 19th and 20th century, when the Christian Britishers were colonizing India and ruling over India, they would say, oh, this bhakti, it looks kind of like Christianity. And the Hindus would be like, oh yeah, same. It's the same thing. So there have been conversations which Hindus have very wisely said that their bhakti is very similar, if not the same thing, to Christianity, trying to bridge that gap, which makes sense because they want to get any leverage they can with the people who have pretty much enslaved them when the British colonized them. All right, so that's the end. This is a picture from South India. South India is beautiful. You should go there. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.